The first thing John Jones realized was that he was upside down. His head was lower than his feet. His chest was pressed against cold limestone, and his shoulders were wedged so tightly inside the narrow passage that he could barely move. He tried to push himself backward. Nothing happened. He tried to twist his body. Nothing. Then he heard his brother's voice somewhere behind him. "John." John took a breath, but the air felt strangely heavy. "I'm stuck." For a moment, nobody spoke. Then someone told him not to move. But John already knew something was terribly wrong. He hadn't discovered a way through the cave. He had crawled into a place that was never meant to be entered. And now the only way out was the tiny opening behind his shoulders. Except his body was facing the wrong direction. And gravity was pulling him deeper. On November 24, 2009, John Edward Jones entered Nutty Putty Cave in Utah with family members and friends. He was 26 years old, a medical student, a husband, and a father. The cave was known for its narrow passages and tight spaces. It was the kind of place where visitors crawled through tunnels, squeezed between rocks, and explored chambers hidden beneath the ground. For John, it was supposed to be an adventure. Something he would laugh about later. Something he would tell his friends about. But underground, darkness changes the way you understand distance. A passage that looks harmless from one angle can become impossibly narrow only a few feet later. A turn can hide a dead end. And once you are deep enough inside a cave, there is no sky above you. No sunlight. No horizon. Just rock. John and the others explored deeper into the cave. Eventually, John found himself near a narrow passage that was known for being extremely tight. He believed he had found another route through the cave. It looked small. But he thought there was enough space to continue. So he crawled forward. His shoulders scraped against the limestone. His clothes dragged over the rough surface. Every movement became more difficult. The passage narrowed around him. Still, John continued. Another few inches. Then another. He couldn't see very far ahead. His flashlight illuminated only a small section of stone. Beyond that was complete darkness. But John believed there would be a larger opening ahead. Maybe a chamber. Maybe another tunnel. Maybe enough space to turn around. So he pushed himself farther inside. Then suddenly, he couldn't move backward. He tried again. His boots scraped against the rock. Nothing. He pushed with his arms. Nothing. His chest was compressed against the stone. His head was below his feet. His shoulders were locked inside the narrow passage. John had crawled into a space only about 18 inches wide and 10 inches high. And now his own body was blocking the way out. He was trapped. His family members realized something was wrong. At first, there was still hope. They believed they could pull him out. People had become trapped in caves before. Rescuers had experienced dealing with dangerous underground environments. Surely someone could reach him. A call for help was made. Soon, rescuers began arriving. But even reaching John was difficult. The passage was so narrow that rescuers had to crawl through it. They couldn't stand. They couldn't turn around normally. They couldn't easily carry equipment. Every movement had to be slow and deliberate. The deeper they went, the darker the cave became. Eventually, one of the rescuers reached John. For the first time, another person was close enough to speak directly to him. John was still conscious. He could talk. He could respond. And that gave everyone hope. They began developing a plan to pull him backward. But there was a serious problem. The passage wasn't straight. It curved around the rock. John's body was wedged into the narrowest part. He couldn't get his hands into a position where he could push himself free. The rescuers couldn't simply grab his legs and pull. They needed equipment. They needed leverage. And they needed a way to move him through a passage that barely had enough room for his body. They began constructing a hauling system. Ropes were positioned. Anchors were secured. Equipment was carried into the cave. Every movement required several people. The rescuers worked in darkness, surrounded by cold stone and limited oxygen. John remained upside down. And that was becoming increasingly dangerous. The human body isn't designed to remain inverted for long periods. Blood begins to collect toward the head. Pressure builds. Breathing becomes more difficult. The longer John remained trapped, the greater the danger became. But he was still alive. He could still speak. He could still hear the rescuers. And they were determined to bring him out. The first major attempt began. The rescuers pulled on the ropes. John's body moved. Only slightly. But it moved. That tiny movement gave everyone hope. They pulled again. John moved a little farther. The rescuers believed they were finally making progress. After hours underground, freedom suddenly seemed possible. John was closer to the larger passage. Closer to the people waiting outside. Closer to his wife and family. But then something went wrong. The rescue system failed. One of the anchors holding the equipment gave way. The tension disappeared. And John dropped back into the narrow passage. The progress was gone. The hope that had filled the cave moments earlier disappeared with it. John was back where he had started. Only now he was weaker. More exhausted. And the rescuers knew they were running out of time. More people arrived to help. Eventually, more than 100 rescuers and volunteers would become involved in the operation. Some were emergency responders. Some were experienced cave rescuers. Others simply wanted to help. People worked in shifts because the cave was exhausting even for those who weren't trapped. The cold stone pressed against their bodies. The narrow passages made movement difficult. There was almost no room to work. And every person entering the cave understood that one mistake could create another emergency. But nobody wanted to give up. John was still alive. So they kept working. They spoke to him. They encouraged him. They told him they were going to get him out. And eventually, John was able to communicate with his wife. For a moment, the darkness around him seemed less frightening. He could hear a familiar voice. Someone from the world above. Someone who was waiting for him. Someone who believed he was coming home. But beneath that emotional moment was a terrible reality. John was still upside down. Still trapped. Still surrounded by stone. And every minute was making his condition worse. The rescuers tried different methods. They worked on the rocks. They adjusted the ropes. They changed the position of the equipment. They searched for better ways to pull him free. But the passage gave them almost no room for error. The cave wasn't simply holding John in place. It was preventing the rescuers from getting enough leverage to remove him. Eventually, John's condition began to deteriorate. His voice became weaker. His responses became slower. The rescuers continued talking to him. They kept telling him to stay awake. But there was only so much the human body could endure. The rescuers continued working. They refused to stop. But eventually, John lost consciousness. The situation changed immediately. They were no longer simply trying to rescue a trapped man. They were fighting against time itself. Every second mattered. Every movement mattered. Every decision mattered. But the cave remained the same. Cold. Narrow. Unforgiving. Approximately 27 hours after John entered the cave, he died. He was 26 years old. He had entered the cave expecting an adventure. Instead, he never came back out. But even after his death, the rescuers faced another terrible problem. They could not safely remove his body. The passage was simply too dangerous. Any attempt to retrieve him could put additional lives at risk. The rescuers had already pushed the cave and their equipment to its limits. Eventually, the decision was made to leave John where he had died. Nutty Putty Cave was permanently sealed. The entrance was closed. The cave became inaccessible. John's final resting place remained underground. And that is what makes this story so disturbing. There was no monster. No mysterious creature. No supernatural force waiting in the darkness. The cave didn't chase John. It didn't attack him. It simply existed. The danger came from a passage that looked like it had enough room. A passage that seemed possible to enter. A passage that John believed would eventually open into something larger. But it didn't. And by the time he realized that, he was already too far inside. That's the terrifying lesson hidden inside this story. Sometimes danger doesn't announce itself. Sometimes it doesn't look dangerous at all. Sometimes it looks like an opportunity. A shortcut. A tunnel. A place you think you can squeeze through. And sometimes, the moment you discover you were wrong is the moment you realize you can no longer turn around. John was only a short distance from the surface. People were standing above him. Rescuers were physically close enough to hear his voice. His family was waiting. Yet none of them could simply reach him. That is one of the cruelest realities of underground spaces. You can be only a few hundred feet from the outside world and still be completely unreachable. You can hear people calling your name. You can hear them working to save you. You can know that help is right there. And still be trapped by a few inches of rock. Today, Nutty Putty Cave remains sealed. John Jones remains inside. The place where he became trapped was never turned into an ordinary tourist attraction again. It became something darker. A warning. A memorial. A reminder that underground, the smallest mistake can become irreversible. John entered the darkness believing there was a way through. There wasn't. And once the cave closed around him, there was no room left to turn back. The most frightening part isn't that John entered a dangerous cave. It's that he entered a passage that didn't look dangerous until it was too late. And somewhere beneath the Utah ground, behind a sealed entrance, that narrow passage remains silent. Cold. Untouched. A place where a man went looking for a way through. And discovered there was no way out. The sound began as a whisper. At first, Daniel thought it was water. A thin, distant dripping somewhere beyond the darkness. Drip. 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 He stopped crawling and listened. The sound came again. But this time, it didn't sound like water. It sounded like breathing. Daniel held his flashlight toward the darkness. Nothing. Only a narrow tunnel disappearing beneath the mountain. He looked behind him. The entrance was already out of sight. He tried to turn around. His shoulder struck the rock. There wasn't enough room. Then the ceiling shifted above him. A small piece of stone fell onto his back. Daniel froze. And somewhere deeper inside the tunnel, something made a long scraping sound. He had entered the mine looking for an old chamber. Now he wasn't sure whether the sound ahead of him was coming from the mountain. Or from someone else trapped inside it. Daniel had always been fascinated by abandoned underground mines. There was something about them that made ordinary places feel completely different. A forest could be dangerous. A mountain could be dangerous. But underground, danger was invisible. You couldn't see a storm coming. You couldn't see an animal approaching. You couldn't even see where the ground ended. Everything depended on the narrow beam of a flashlight. Daniel had explored abandoned structures before, but this particular mine was different. It had been closed for decades. The entrance was hidden behind trees and overgrown vegetation. Old warning signs hung near the opening, their paint faded by years of rain and snow. The signs warned people to stay out. Daniel ignored them. He wasn't alone. 2 friends had entered the mine with him. They planned to explore for less than an hour, take some photographs, and leave before sunset. At first, everything seemed harmless. The entrance opened into a large tunnel. The air was cold and damp. Water ran down the walls. Their footsteps echoed strangely. Every sound seemed to travel farther underground than it should. The deeper they walked, the quieter the outside world became. Eventually, they could no longer hear birds. They couldn't hear wind. They couldn't hear traffic. There was only the sound of their own breathing. Then they reached a fork. One tunnel continued straight. The other descended sharply. Daniel chose the descending tunnel. It was narrower, but he believed it would lead toward the lower sections of the mine. They continued. The floor became muddy. The walls became darker. Old wooden supports crossed the ceiling. Some were cracked. Others had completely collapsed. Their flashlights moved across the walls, revealing rusted metal, old equipment, and marks left by miners decades earlier. Then Daniel noticed something unusual. There were footprints in the mud. Fresh footprints. He stopped. His friends stopped behind him. Nobody spoke. The footprints were heading deeper into the tunnel. They weren't old. The edges were still sharp. The mud around them was wet. Someone had been there recently. Daniel looked at his friends. They considered turning back. But curiosity won. They followed the footprints. The tunnel narrowed. The ceiling dropped lower. The air became colder. Then they reached a wooden door. It was barely hanging from its hinges. There was no reason for it to be there. Daniel pushed it open. Beyond it was a narrow passage leading down. The footprints continued. Daniel stepped through. His friends followed. They descended farther into the mine. Then the first collapse happened. A violent crack echoed through the tunnel. The ceiling shook. Dust exploded into the air. Daniel instinctively dropped to his knees. Rocks crashed behind them. When the dust finally settled, the passage they had used to enter was blocked. One of Daniel's friends shouted. They ran back. But there was no way through. A wall of broken rock had filled the tunnel. They were trapped underground. At first, they weren't terrified. They still had flashlights. They had water. They had phones. They believed someone would find them. Daniel called emergency services. The signal disappeared. He tried again. Nothing. His friend tried his phone. Nothing. They were beneath too much rock. Their voices couldn't reach the surface. They decided to find another route. The footprints were still visible. Daniel followed them. The 3 men moved deeper into the mine. The tunnel twisted through the mountain. Every few minutes, they stopped to listen. Sometimes they heard dripping water. Sometimes they heard the distant cracking of stone. And sometimes, they heard footsteps. At first, they assumed it was their own movement echoing through the tunnels. But then Daniel stopped. The others stopped too. The footsteps continued. Slow. Heavy. Coming from somewhere ahead. One step. Then another. Then silence. Daniel raised his flashlight. The beam disappeared into darkness. Nothing moved. He called out. Hello. His voice echoed through the tunnel. Then came an answer. A faint sound. So distant that they couldn't understand the words. Daniel called again. The answer came back. This time, it sounded closer. They looked at each other. Someone else was inside the mine. They followed the voice. The tunnel became narrower. The floor dropped. Eventually, they reached a small chamber. There was an old helmet on the ground. Next to it was a metal water bottle. And on the wall, someone had scratched a series of lines into the stone. 4 groups of 5. Then another group. Then another. Someone had been counting days. Daniel's stomach tightened. If those marks were recent, someone had been trapped underground. And if someone was still alive, they might be deeper inside. They heard the voice again. This time, it was clearly human. Help! Daniel moved toward it. His friends followed. The voice seemed to come from behind a collapsed section of rock. They searched for a way around. There wasn't one. Daniel shouted, "Can you hear me?" The answer came immediately. Yes. A man's voice. Weak. Exhausted. Daniel asked how long he had been trapped. There was a long silence. Then the man answered, "I don't know." That answer frightened Daniel more than anything else. They asked for his name. The man didn't respond. They asked what had happened. Again, silence. Then the voice said something that made all 3 men stop breathing. "Don't come through here." Daniel stared at the rocks. "Why?" The man answered quietly, "The mountain is moving." Then they heard it. A deep rumbling beneath their feet. Not loud. Not violent. Just a low vibration moving through the stone. Dust fell from the ceiling. Daniel immediately pulled his friends backward. The tunnel trembled. Then stopped. They waited. Nothing happened. They considered returning to the blocked entrance. But that route was impossible. Their only option was to search for another way out. They continued deeper. The voice behind the rocks faded. Daniel kept thinking about the stranger. Who was he? How long had he been there? Why had nobody found him? And why had he warned them not to come closer? Eventually, they reached another passage. The ceiling was low. They had to crawl. Daniel went first. His knees moved through cold mud. His hands pressed against wet stone. Every breath filled his lungs with damp air. Behind him, his friends crawled silently. Then Daniel's flashlight flickered. Once. Twice. The beam became weaker. He stopped. His friend asked what was wrong. Daniel looked at the battery indicator. They were running low. The darkness around them suddenly felt enormous. They turned off the lights for a few seconds to conserve power. Immediately, the world disappeared. There was no difference between closing your eyes and opening them. Total darkness. Then Daniel heard breathing. Not his own. Someone was breathing behind him. Slowly. Close. Daniel turned on the flashlight. His friends were directly behind him. Both of them were staring forward. Neither had moved. Daniel looked back. Nothing. He continued crawling. They eventually reached a larger chamber. The floor was covered in old mining equipment. Rusted tools. Broken wooden crates. Pieces of machinery. And on the far wall was a narrow vertical opening. Cold air was coming through it. Daniel felt it against his face. Fresh air. They had found another route. They squeezed through. The passage climbed upward. For the first time in hours, they felt hope. The air became cleaner. The temperature changed. They could smell soil. Maybe the tunnel led outside. Daniel climbed faster. His hands shook from exhaustion. He reached a bend. And stopped. There was light ahead. Not flashlight light. Natural light. A small opening in the rock. He could see trees. The surface. Freedom. He called to his friends. They climbed toward him. But before Daniel could reach the opening, the mountain moved again. The sound was enormous. Stone cracked somewhere beneath them. The passage shook. Daniel grabbed the wall. His friends shouted. A section of ceiling collapsed behind them. The tunnel filled with dust. Daniel pushed forward. He could still see daylight. Only a few meters away. He crawled toward it. Then the opening collapsed. A wall of dirt and stone slammed down directly in front of him. The daylight disappeared. Daniel stared at the rock. He couldn't believe it. They had been seconds away from escaping. Now they were trapped again. The three men sat in darkness. Their lights were fading. Their water was running low. The air felt heavier. Nobody spoke. Then Daniel remembered the stranger. The man behind the collapsed tunnel. The warning. The mountain is moving. Daniel suddenly realized something. The footprints they had followed weren't leading toward an exit. They were leading toward the deepest section of the mine. Someone had deliberately walked that way. And if the stranger had been trapped there, why had he been walking deeper? Daniel turned toward the tunnel behind them. He heard something. A faint scraping. Then footsteps. The same footsteps they had heard before. Slow. Heavy. Approaching. Daniel raised his flashlight. The beam trembled. His friend stared into the darkness. The footsteps stopped. A voice whispered from somewhere ahead. "You shouldn't have followed me." Daniel's blood went cold. The voice was the same voice from behind the rocks. But that was impossible. The stranger was trapped behind a collapse. He couldn't have moved. Daniel shouted. "Where are you?" No answer. Then something struck the tunnel wall. Once. Twice. 3 times. The sound echoed through the mine. Daniel realized the noise wasn't coming from ahead. It was coming from behind them. They turned. The darkness seemed empty. Then a flashlight appeared far down the tunnel. Someone was standing there. The beam pointed directly at them. Daniel couldn't see the person's face. He shouted, "Who are you?" The figure didn't answer. It simply stood there. Then the light disappeared. Daniel and his friends began running. They crawled through the tunnel as quickly as they could. Behind them, footsteps followed. They didn't know whether the person was real. They didn't know whether the cave was playing tricks on them. They only knew they wanted to get away. Eventually, they reached the original collapse. There was still no way through. They were trapped between the blocked entrance and the collapsed chamber. Daniel's flashlight flickered again. Then it went out. Darkness swallowed everything. One of his friends began breathing rapidly. Daniel told him to stay calm. But Daniel couldn't stay calm himself. He could hear the footsteps. Closer. Closer. Then silence. A hand touched Daniel's shoulder. He screamed. His friend grabbed him. But when they turned the remaining flashlight toward the place where the hand had been, there was nobody there. The 3 men stayed together. They waited. Eventually, they heard a new sound. Helicopters. Rescue teams had located the mine. The men shouted. They were alive. The rescuers eventually reached them through another access point. Hours later, the 3 men were brought back to the surface. Sunlight hit Daniel's face. He had forgotten how bright the sky could be. He stood outside the mine and looked back at the entrance. The rescuers asked them how they had survived. Daniel told them about the stranger. The footprints. The voice. The warnings. The rescue team searched the mine. They found no missing person. No body. No recent equipment. No signs that anyone had been living underground. But they did find something. Deep inside the mine, behind a collapsed section, they discovered an old helmet. The helmet had been underground for decades. It was covered in dust. The rescuers also found the scratched marks on the wall. They weren't recent. They had been made many years earlier. Nobody could explain the voice. Nobody could explain the footsteps. And nobody could explain why Daniel and his friends had seen a flashlight moving through a section of the mine that rescuers later determined was completely inaccessible. Daniel never entered another abandoned mine. Years later, he would still remember the moment the stranger spoke to him. "You shouldn't have followed me." But there was one detail that bothered him more than anything else. When the rescue team finally reached the three men, one of the rescuers asked Daniel a simple question. "How did you know which tunnel to take?" Daniel pointed toward the passage. "The footprints." The rescuer stared at him. "What footprints?" Daniel looked down. There were no footprints. Not one. The floor was covered in undisturbed dust. Except for the footprints belonging to Daniel and his two friends. The footprints they had followed had never existed. And that left Daniel with a question he could never answer. If there had never been another person inside the mine, whose voice had told them to turn back? And whose footsteps had followed them through the darkness? Some places are dangerous because of what is inside them. Others are dangerous because of what might still be there. And sometimes, the most frightening thing about being trapped underground isn't the possibility that you may never escape. It's the possibility that you were never alone down there. The last photograph showed a pair of eyes. They were barely visible in the darkness. Two pale reflections staring directly into the camera. At first, Michael thought they belonged to an animal. Then he noticed something impossible. The eyes were at human height. And they were standing much farther inside the tunnel than anyone in their group had gone. Michael stared at the photograph again. Who took this? Nobody answered. The camera belonged to him. He had taken the picture himself. But he had no memory of seeing anyone standing there. The photograph was taken 11 minutes earlier. And according to the timestamp, Michael was alone when he took it. The expedition had begun 3 hours earlier. Michael and 4 other experienced explorers had entered an abandoned limestone cave system beneath a remote mountain region. They weren't tourists. They had proper helmets, climbing equipment, ropes, lights, food, water, and emergency communication devices. They had studied maps of the cave. They had marked their route. They knew where the major chambers were. And they had been warned about one particular section. A deep vertical shaft known by local explorers as the Black Mouth. Nobody knew exactly how deep it was. Old maps showed different measurements. Some suggested it was 30 meters. Others claimed it was much deeper. Several explorers had descended into it over the years. But nobody had ever reached the bottom. That was why Michael wanted to see it. The cave began normally. The entrance opened into a wide chamber where sunlight still reached the rocks. But after several hundred meters, the light disappeared. The temperature dropped. The air became wet and cold. Water ran along the walls. Their footsteps echoed through the tunnels. The deeper they went, the quieter the world became. Eventually, they reached the first major chamber. From there, the tunnel descended sharply. They secured their ropes and began climbing down. One person at a time. Michael went second. Below him, his friend David disappeared into darkness. Above him, the others waited. The rope moved slowly through Michael's gloves. His boots touched the rock wall. He descended another few meters. Then another. The shaft seemed endless. His helmet light illuminated only a small circle of stone. Everything beyond it was black. He looked down. Nothing. He couldn't see David anymore. "How far?" Michael called. David's voice came back faintly. "Keep coming." Michael continued. The deeper he went, the colder it became. Water dripped from the ceiling. The droplets struck his helmet. Each one sounded like a tiny knock. Eventually, his boots touched solid ground. He looked around. The chamber below was enormous. His light couldn't reach the far walls. The others descended. When everyone was together, they noticed something strange. There were no footprints. No signs of previous visitors. No equipment. No old rope. Nothing. It was as though nobody had ever reached this place before. They began exploring. The chamber split into several tunnels. The team selected the largest one. It sloped downward. They followed it for almost an hour. Then they found another shaft. This one was even deeper. Their maps showed nothing. Michael checked the coordinates. They were far below the mapped section of the cave. The others wanted to turn back. Michael argued that they should investigate for only a few minutes. They secured another rope. One by one, they descended. At the bottom, they discovered something that changed the atmosphere immediately. There was a metal door. Not a natural formation. Not an old mining structure. A door. Embedded directly into the limestone. It was covered with rust. There were no markings. No handle. Only a small circular opening near the center. Michael touched it. The metal was freezing cold. David told him to leave it alone. Michael opened it anyway. The door moved with a deep metallic groan. Behind it was a narrow corridor. The walls were perfectly straight. Someone had built it. The group stared at one another. A cave was one thing. An underground structure was another. They entered. The corridor continued for hundreds of meters. The natural cave disappeared behind them. The walls were concrete. The floor was covered in dust. Every sound echoed. Their footsteps seemed to come from several directions at once. Then they saw the first door. It was open. Inside was a small room. There was an old chair. A rusted table. And a wall covered with handwritten numbers. Hundreds of them. Some were dates. Others were measurements. Michael photographed the wall. Then he noticed something written at the bottom. 3 words. "Do not descend." Nobody spoke. They continued anyway. The corridor eventually ended at another vertical shaft. This one was enormous. Michael shined his light downward. The beam disappeared. No reflection. No visible floor. Nothing. David leaned over the edge. "That's not normal." Michael asked why. David pointed at the wall. There were scratches in the limestone. Long vertical marks. As if something had repeatedly climbed up and down the shaft. The team decided to stop. They would return the next day with better equipment. But before they could leave, they heard a sound. A deep impact from somewhere below. Boom. The entire chamber vibrated. Dust fell from the ceiling. Everyone froze. Then came another impact. Boom. Something was moving beneath them. They immediately began climbing back toward the corridor. Michael went last. He looked down one final time. His flashlight caught something. A tiny reflection far below. 2 points of light. Like eyes. Michael blinked. They disappeared. He climbed faster. The group returned to the surface route. But when they reached the first shaft, something was wrong. Their rope was missing. They searched the chamber. Nothing. The rope they had used to descend was gone. Their emergency rope was still there. But the main rope had disappeared. Nobody could explain it. They decided to climb using the remaining equipment. One person went first. Then another. Michael waited below. When he looked toward the tunnel, he saw something standing there. A human figure. Completely still. Michael raised his light. The figure disappeared. He shouted for the others. Nobody heard him. He started climbing. Halfway up, the rope moved. Not because he was pulling it. Something above him was pulling it downward. Michael grabbed tighter. The rope stopped. Then moved again. Slowly. As if someone were trying to pull him back into the shaft. Michael screamed. His friends above began pulling him. Together, they dragged him upward. When he finally reached the top, he looked down. Nothing was there. They continued toward the exit. The cave seemed different now. The tunnels looked longer. The turns seemed unfamiliar. The group checked their maps. Their position didn't make sense. They should have been close to the entrance. Instead, the cave continued deeper. They walked for another 30 minutes. Then another. The emergency radio failed. Their phones had no signal. Their compass needle began spinning. Michael stopped. Something was wrong with the cave. They had followed the same route back. But the tunnels were no longer matching their maps. Eventually, they found another chamber. In the center was a pool of perfectly still water. The surface was black. Michael approached it. He shined his light across the surface. He saw his reflection. Then he saw someone standing behind him. Michael spun around. Nobody. He looked back into the water. The reflection was still there. But now the figure was closer. Michael stepped backward. The others saw it too. They immediately moved away from the pool. Nobody wanted to touch the water. They took another tunnel. After several minutes, they heard a familiar sound. Dripping water. Michael recognized it. It was the same sound they had heard near the entrance. That shouldn't have been possible. They were deep underground. But the sound was identical. They followed it. The tunnel opened into a large chamber. And there, in the center, was the same metal door they had discovered earlier. They had somehow returned to it. But they had been walking in a completely different direction. The group realized they were lost. Not just geographically. They were trapped in a cave system that no longer seemed to follow normal logic. They decided to retrace their steps. Michael opened his camera. He wanted to check the photographs. That was when he saw the photograph of the eyes. He zoomed in. The figure was standing at the end of the corridor. He looked at the timestamp. 11 minutes earlier. He checked the photograph's location data. The camera had recorded coordinates. Michael stared at the screen. The coordinates showed something impossible. The photograph had been taken from a location several hundred meters deeper than their current position. They were standing in the same corridor. But the camera claimed Michael had taken the photograph farther inside. Nobody understood. Then David noticed something else. The figure in the photograph wasn't looking toward the camera. It was looking behind Michael. As though something else was standing there. The group fell silent. A sound came from the corridor. Footsteps. Slow. Bare feet against concrete. Step. 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 They switched off their lights. The footsteps continued. The sound came closer. Then stopped. Nobody moved. A voice whispered from the darkness. "You're going the wrong way." Michael recognized the voice. It was his own. He turned toward David. David's face had gone white. The voice came again. This time from behind them. "You're going the wrong way." It was exactly Michael's voice. The group ran. They didn't care which tunnel they chose. They just wanted distance. Their lights bounced across the walls. Their breathing became louder. Their boots slipped on wet stone. Behind them, footsteps followed. Then the footsteps became running. They reached a narrow passage and squeezed through. Michael went first. David followed. The others came behind. Then the ceiling collapsed. Rock crashed down between them. Michael and David were separated from the others. They shouted. No response. They were alone. The passage ahead was barely wide enough to crawl through. They had no choice. They continued. After 20 minutes, the passage opened. Michael looked around. His flashlight revealed a familiar chamber. The same chamber with the pool. The same black water. The same walls. David stared at him. "We've been here." Michael nodded. They had somehow returned to the same place. David suggested they follow the opposite tunnel. They did. The tunnel continued downward. Eventually, they reached the enormous shaft. The one with the metal door. The one they had promised never to return to. Michael looked over the edge. His flashlight beam disappeared. Then he saw the two reflections again. Two eyes. But this time they were closer. Much closer. David pulled him away. They turned to run. Then the radio crackled. One of their missing teammates was calling. "Michael?" Michael grabbed the radio. "Where are you?" Static. Then the voice answered. "We're at the entrance." Michael froze. "That's impossible." The voice became distorted. "Come back." Michael looked at David. The radio crackled again. Then a voice whispered. "Don't trust them." The transmission died. David stared at Michael. "That wasn't them." Michael asked why. David pointed toward the corridor. There were 4 sets of footprints in the dust. Their own. But there was a 5th set. The footprints were wet. They came from the direction of the shaft. And they followed Michael and David. Not away from them. Toward them. They ran. Eventually, after hours of wandering, they found a narrow crack where cold air was moving through. They squeezed through. The passage became tighter. David became stuck. Michael pulled him free. They continued crawling. Then sunlight appeared ahead. Real sunlight. They reached the surface. They had escaped. Rescue teams were already searching for them. Their 3 missing teammates were found several hours later through another section of the cave. Everyone survived. But the story didn't end there. The authorities sealed the cave. Explorers were forbidden from entering. The metal door was never officially explained. And when investigators reviewed Michael's camera, they found something disturbing. The photograph of the eyes was not the only strange image. There were 6 photographs taken after the group had supposedly left the underground structure. Michael had no memory of taking them. The first showed the metal door. The second showed the black pool. The third showed the enormous shaft. The fourth showed Michael and David crawling through the narrow passage. The fifth showed the cave entrance. And the sixth showed Michael standing outside the cave, taken from behind him, as though someone else had been watching. The photograph was time-stamped several minutes before the rescue team reached him. Michael never learned who took it. But years later, he returned to the location. He stood outside the sealed entrance. He didn't go inside. He simply looked at the mountain. Then he heard something. A faint sound beneath the ground. 3 knocks. Knock. 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 Michael walked away. Because he remembered something written on the wall inside the underground corridor. Do not descend. But there had been another sentence beneath it. A sentence he hadn't noticed during the expedition. The rescue team later photographed it. It read, "If you hear your own voice, you are already too deep." And that is what still bothers Michael. Because when he thinks back to that night, he remembers hearing his own voice telling him to turn around. But he also remembers something else. Before the voice spoke, he had already been hearing it. For hours. From somewhere beneath the mountain. And sometimes, even now, when Michael is alone in a quiet room, he says he can still hear those 3 knocks. Not from the door. Not from the walls. But from somewhere underneath him. As if whatever was waiting below never stopped listening.